You remember the Fantastic Four?
Why do people talk about the Fantastic Four like it's such an important comic? For years, on my old podcast Wits End, I would talk about how the early Fantastic Four issues were my first comics. They made me a Jack Kirby junkie and a lifelong fan of the medium. The Fantastic Four get thrown around because this book really was the start of modern comic storytelling. It was the beginning of everything. The transcript for this essay is available on my website, witsendpod.com. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and desperation is exactly the reason Fantastic Four came to be. Before their debut, superhero comics weren't as popular as they were in their heyday in the 30s and 40s, especially post Frederick Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent, when comics were accused of turning the people who read them into brain-rotted deviants. Even after the Wortham culling, comic books survived, but didn't come out unscathed. Before it was called Marvel, the publishing company was called Timely Comics. During the Timely era in the 40s, Submariner, Human Torch, and Captain America were known for their wartime adventures. In the 50s, war stories and superhero comics lost their demand. Eventually, the company transitioned to Atlas, where it started pushing out less superhero stories and more genre tales like horror, westerns, romance, and monster comics. As the story goes, Marvel publisher, before it was called Marvel, Martin Goodman wanted a superhero team that could compete with DC's Justice League of America, which made its debut in 1960. I'm going to skip over the he said, she said parts of the story entirely because it's not important. Goodman's nephew and staffer Stanley Lieber, who would go by Stan Lee, and veteran artist Jack Kirby were put together to bring this new team to life. In 1961, the company rebranded to Marvel and released the first issue of Fantastic Four, leading to the Marvel Age of comics. Let's go back a little bit. Jack Kirby already had experience doing type characters or ensemble books. He did a book at DC in the late 50s called Challengers of the Unknown, 4 people tackling the weird events of their time that no one else would go near. In that book, there were similarities with the FF. There was Professor Haley, the brains, Rocky, the boxer, Red, the hot-headed stuntman, Ace, the pilot. Eventually, another member, June Robbins, was added, who was an engineer experienced in building giant robots. Another comic strip Kirby did during this time with artist Wallace Wood was called Sky Masters, which is fueled by real-world space exploration and Cold War paranoia. There are these little touchstones and experiences that blended together that would ultimately be refined in FF's formula. It's that with these late 50s endeavors like Sky Masters or Challengers, there isn't that extra seasoning that Fantastic Four has, even though their DNA lives on in FF. Fantastic Four is Sky Masters, Challenges of the Unknown, and all of those Atlas monster comics blended together but done very well. Despite his flaws, Stan Lee's salesmanship and copywriting added the extra oomph those stories needed. They were dramatic, encouraged engagement from their readership, and almost dared the readers to buy their stories. The Lee and Kirby collaboration clearly resonated with readers. I've talked about Kirby's 70s post-Marvel work pretty often. However, there are camps where some people prefer the 60s work to Kirby's output after, or vice versa. What started off as a team book experiment became the foundation of the Marvel Age of comics. The way Marvel's stories were produced was different than DC or other publishers, which was called the Marvel method. Other publishers would do full scripts. Lee and his co-creators/collaborators would discuss plot points, or there would be a description of the story. Kirby, Steve Ditko, or whoever was working on the story would draw the pages, basically plotting out the comic. When the pages were turned in, Lee would write dialogue, and Artie Simek, who was FF's main letterer during this time, would put the actual text, boxes, and bubbles onto the artwork. An unsung hero of this era is Stan Goldberg, who came up with a lot of the color concepts for the characters during this time, including the Fantastic Four. So those costumes looking the way they do should be credited to Goldberg. Later on, it becomes apparent that Kirby is fully steering the ship and Lee is adding in dialogue, or Lee would be leaning into the soap opera element. As people read these stories, it becomes apparent who did what based on where Lee and Kirby's individual interests lie. Like I mentioned, the early stories, especially that first issue, were a mix of everything the company had done so far. It didn't lean into a full-on superhero comic early on. The team didn't even have costumes in the first couple issues. They wore their street clothes, unstable molecules included. One of the benefits of this world is that everything feels established. When Reed Richards fires the iconic flare into the sky, the story invites curiosity, bringing an air of mystery and pushing readers to flip the next page as the team comes together. This first issue benefits from non-linear storytelling, introducing the characters and their powers, and then explaining the origin of the rocket being bombarded by cosmic rays and crash landing in the forest. The feeling of the already established world would be a common theme with other villains and side characters. It's a 10-cent pamphlet printed on cheap newsprint, but readers got their money's worth. In that one issue, we're introduced to the team, shown their powers, get their origin, and also get the introductions of Monster Isle and the debut of the first Fantastic Four villain. Mole Man's origin is one page, but it's such an effective use of it. Monster Isle gets blown up, and it kind of feels like saying goodbye to the days of monster comics, and hello to the Marvel Age. On top of the superhero elements, the early FF stories commented on social topics. Marvel would have stories about aliens like the Skrulls invading, which were an allegory for Soviet spies, but they would also do stories where an alien rampaging through New York is actually just a child looking for their parents. The Infant Terrible story is one of the highlights of the 60s and shows how Lee and Kirby would try to subvert expectations. Even the Skrulls get developed later in the series, where Kirby and Lee do Romeo and Juliet in space. So even if these stories are viewed as outdated today, they're still multifaceted when comics were kind of junky throwaway pamphlets. One of the most infamous stories features the Hate Monger, a purple hood-wearing villain who uses a hate ray to turn everyone on the planet against each other. In the end, he turns out to be none other than... It's moments like this that induce a side-eye when people mention how comics never have any social commentary, because clearly this is just dumb fun. No social commentary here at all. As the stories go on, they lean into soap opera and romance elements, bringing in that essential Stan Lee melodrama these comics are known for. It was something that set them apart from, say, the Justice League. Where those DC stories were mostly a villain appearing and being taken down by the JLA, Marvel 60s stories leaned into human flaws and struggles like relationships or money issues, or dealing with aspects of otherness like with The Thing or X-Men. Marvel had superhero comics, but they added that element of why should we care about the person under the costume? Even though the FF were extremely rooted in science fiction, they still had money problems. Reed Richards would make income through patents or selling designs to the government. Lee and Kirby still found a way to keep their characters humbled when they were pretty far removed from normal. These stories weren't just about the costumes. The world around the characters was as lively as the main cast. Lee and Kirby paid attention to the FF's neighborhood, their fans, and detractors. Their mailman, Willie Lumpkin, would show up in some stories. Even Reed's old college roommate ended up becoming their worst enemy. Well into the run, Sue and Johnny's father is revealed. There was always some form of world building in these stories that made the characters feel like more than drawings and words on a page. The progression of these stories is also marked by the inkers who worked on Kirby's pencils. While the inker for Fantastic Four #1 was George Klein, the main inker for the early Fantastic Four issues was Dick Ayers. Ayers is known for his thick, weighty line work. Around the issue 17 to 19 range, Ayers switches it up and uses thinner lines. On his last issue, Fantastic Four #20, featuring the first appearance of Molecule Man, Ayers seems to be using the biggest brush he can find in probably the inkiest issue of the series. Inker George Bell Russos took over Fantastic Four after Ayers. Bell's style is more thin and scratchy. He's a controversial inker, and I wasn't a fan of his style when I first saw it. I still think his work looks better in black and white. One of the issues that showcases his strengths is the Hate Monger issue. The entire feel of that story is frantic, so it fits Bell's scratchy lines. Vince Colletta takes over after Bell, and Colletta, for those who don't know, has a notorious history of cutting corners. People in charge liked him because he could hit deadlines. However, hitting deadlines came at the cost of erasing figures and backgrounds from Jack Kirby's pencils. He does have some solid Kirby collaborations like In the Days of the Mob from the early 70s, but his Fantastic Four work is really hard to look at. After Colletta, Joe Sinnott, the jelly to Jack Kirby's peanut butter, joins the series with Fantastic Four #44. He stays on for the whole stretch and adds more ethos to the Lee and Kirby team. Sinnott joined when this book started going crazy. The introduction of the Inhumans, Galactus, Black Panther, all the way through Kirby's departure on the book. His sleek inking style becomes as much a part of the book as Lee and Kirby's storytelling and copywriting. Unlike the other inkers, Sinnott gets an arc. His first issue looks less refined than his last issue working over Kirby's pencils. Just as Kirby gets better, wilder, more experimental, Sinnott improves too. New readers might check out these early stories and go, I don't know about this Kirby guy. There are certain issues where Kirby rips out the brakes and does something weird. When someone runs into their first Kirby collage, that's a pause and take it in moment. These 12-cent pamphlets printed on cheap newsprint with these weird collages thrown in add to the sci-fi roots of the Fantastic Four. There are times when readers can notice the communication breakdown between Lee and Kirby. In the art of Fantastic Four number 17, Kirby has Sue saving the day by defeating Dr. Doom, but Lee writes her as a damsel. Kirby is the guy who created Big Barda. He doesn't do damsels. I'll admit, the really dated parts of these stories stem from how Sue Storm is depicted. Unfortunately for Invisible Woman fans, her character doesn't really develop too much until later. She does have some great moments later on. From the surviving Kirby pencils, his original notes can be seen in the margins to compare to what made it into some of the final stories. Even with how outlandish these characters and stories are, Lee and Kirby keep them grounded. Reed Richards would rather be building devices or traveling through dimensions, but the mundane things like paying bills or running errands drains the life out of him. He's dealing with noise complaints or elderly neighbors asking him to look for their pets. Sue Storm would knock out Dr. Doom and head to a modeling job after. I don't think any character represents what these 60s Marvel stories mean more than Ben Grimm. He's the new kind of character they were trying to depict. A multi-dimensional noble cigar-chomping monster from the Lower East Side who is kind of the heart of the whole story. He's also the character most closely associated with his co-creator.
Well, I identify with the Thing, if you must know. Despite his looks, I think he's a very heartwarming character. I try to portray him that way.
I mean, for a while, the Thing becomes the Marvel mascot well into the 70s, which I'll get to at a later time. Marvel did end up using Ben as the logo for their Merry Marvel Marching Society. These stories don't always take themselves seriously, and there's quite a bit of slapstick and bantering on top of the cosmic mumbo-jumbo. FF's first 30 or so issues are mostly world building. From issues 36 to 47, Lee and Kirby introduce the Frightful Four, which leads right into their Inhumans arc, featuring the creation of the Negative Zone. During this time, Reed and Sue get married. FF number 48 through 50 is where things start to change in this collaboration. There's a reason why the Galactus trilogy is heralded as much as it is. It was a turning point for these stories. Even though they were rooted in science fiction, the arrival of Galactus was an apocalyptic event. Kirby ripped out the brakes and floored it. The sky burst into flame, a silver figure on a surfboard warned of impending destruction. Two giant cosmic figures met in the middle of New York as people below watched.
And I had to come up with characters that were no longer stereotypes. In other words, I couldn't depend on gangsters. I had to get something new. And of course, for some reason, I went to the Bible. I came up with Galactus. And there I was in front of this tremendous figure who I knew very well because I've always felt him, and I certainly couldn't treat him in the same way that I would any ordinary mortal. And I remember in my first story, I had to back away from him to resolve that story. And of course, the Silver Surfer is the fallen angel. And when Galactus relegated him to Earth, he stayed on Earth. And that was the beginning of his adventures. And they were figures that had never before been used in comics. They were above mythic figures. And of course, they were the first gods.
The FF couldn't punch their way out of this. The Watcher, who debuted in FF number 13, would appear occasionally to warn of a major event. This is the payoff, the end of the world. Kirby and Lee would leave little hints of something big happening. With all its drama and bombast, the Galactus trilogy is an issue and a half of Galactus, and they move on from the end of the world very fast. It ends with Silver Surfer betraying his master and being trapped on Earth. There are so many subplots in these stories. With the Inhumans being trapped in the negative zone, Silver Surfer now being stuck on Earth, Black Panther would make his first appearances in the series not long after Galactus' debut. Even Galactus himself has an arc that bleeds into Thor's title. I talked about this in the Jack Kirby Fourth World essay I did, but in the Mighty Thor, Kirby planned to have the God of Thunder team up with the Purple Planet Eater to save Earth from a villain called Thermal Man. So Galactus gets an origin and becomes more humanized than Thor, but Kirby was never allowed to follow up on those plot threads. The original pages look amazing, especially with Thor and Galactus sitting around and having a conversation. Writers and artists following Kirby and Lee didn't really try to reform the Planet Eater, and it isn't until decades later that a couple of creative teams, which I'll get to, actually follow up on the Galactus seeds Kirby planted in the pages of Thor. Most people just kept him as the same kind of villain who constantly eats planets. The Galactus trilogy kind of changes everyone, the creative team and the characters. Ben now feels like he has to compete with the Silver Surfer for Alicia Masters. Reed and Sue are worried that something like this will happen again. I used to make fun of how this arc ended. Galactus vanishes and now Johnny Storm has to go to college. That's the immediate follow-up to the Planet Eater's departure in number 50. Human Torch sees the beginning of the universe and then he has to go to class like Galactus never even happened. That's the nature of these stories. The first half of this collaboration moves at breakneck speed, and the next half of this collaboration is about building on the ideas introduced or giving them longer arcs. So much of what makes the FF stand out even now is the science. All of this language like unstable molecules, the negative zone, the microverse, and countless others started in the 60s Fantastic Four comics. Kirby himself was such a voracious consumer of science fiction books and movies, and a lot of that inspiration found its way into his work. He would even do his own modern Kirby remakes of Frankenstein, The Time Machine, and The Hunchback of Notre Dame in this run. Even though Kirby and Lee were presenting new concepts, they would pull old concepts from the past into their modern day. Bill Everett's Namor made his reappearance in the pages of Fantastic Four number 4 from 1962, establishing him as an adversary of the FF and kicking off the love triangle between Reed, Sue, and Namor. Everett even worked at Marvel, inking over Kirby's pencils and some Namor stories in Tales to Astonish. It wasn't until later that he got to write and draw his character again. Later in their collaboration, Kirby and Lee brought back the original Carl Burgos Human Torch, an android who goes by the name Jim Hammond. This wasn't the only time Marvel would pull from World War II concepts. Captain America himself reappeared in Avengers number 4, with Jack Kirby and Joe Simon's The Vision from the Golden Age being retooled as an android character by Roy Thomas and John Buscema for Avengers number 57. When he was introduced in Fantastic Four number 5, Victor Von Doom was only known as a former roommate of Reed Richards who had an interest in science and sorcery. Victor's ego got the best of him, which took him down a wrong turn. His origin is that he's the son of a Romani sorceress and doctor. He had to master science and magic to come into his power. Doom wasn't just hit by cosmic rays and can now shoot lightning out of his hands. So many depictions of him water him down to a character with no real depth. He got revenge on the Latverian government that killed his parents and took over the country. Depending on the depiction, the Latverian people are kind of okay with him as a ruler. The version in the 60s is still more of a tyrant though. Sure, some of his schemes were silly, like trying to steal Blackbeard's treasure with a time machine, or switching bodies with Mr. Fantastic. He's a mix of tragedy and nobility. He mixes a massive ego, a tragic background, a bombastic personality, and his intellect. It's all these qualities and his timeless design that make people root for him, even with all of his pettiness. The more Lee and Kirby developed the character, readers learned that his encounter with Reed was a short pit stop in his overall arc. In later stories, it's revealed that Doom's experiment was his attempt to go to hell to save the soul of his mother. Even his design has a purpose, as it's rooted in Doom's Latverian culture, but also his way of covering up his disfigurement from his experiment gone wrong. Speaking of his suit, we'll talk about someone named Valeria later.
But there's one thing wrong with him. He's got a scratch on his chin. and he's frustrated. He knows he's extremely handsome. He's got the scratch on his chin. Why haven't you got a scratch on your chin? And of course, he doesn't realize that his own anger and frustration is mounting. He's not a bad guy. As you saw in a Fantastic Four, he'd give the Fantastic Four a wonderful meal before he'd kill them.
Doctor Doom doesn't take off the mask. Showing his face isn't necessary. Another thing, Doom is Romani, and this casually gets overlooked or forgotten too often. Fantastic Four number 102 from 1970 brings the end of an era. Jack Kirby puts out one last Fantastic Four story and departs Marvel for the distinguished competition. So in the later issues, he does move really quickly. Even Stan Lee doesn't feel the need to recap or use text boxes as much. While Kirby's pencils and Sinnott's inks are solid as usual, the King very clearly wants to get out of Dodge.
Why I quit it? I can't tell you. The situation demanded it. It's the only thing I can tell you. The details would bore you, but I can tell you that the situation demanded it, and I do what I have to do. I can't vacillate. I'm not an indecisive man. I do what I have to do, and you know, I did it at that time.
For those who haven't read these 60s stories, here is a list of must-read comics from this period. Fantastic Four number 1, which is the start of everything. Fantastic Four number 13, the FF take on the Red Ghost and meet the Watcher. It's the moon landing before the moon landing, featuring inks by Steve Ditko. Fantastic Four Annual number 2, which is Doctor Doom's origin. I'm skipping over Doctor Doom's first appearance from Fantastic Four number 5 because this issue focuses on Victor Von Doom in all his glory. He's the main character of the story, and it covers his rise to power, first meeting with Reed Richards, and more of his dark past. It's a great issue. Fantastic Four number 51, probably one of the best single issues of all time. It shows why Ben's power comes from who he is and not because of cosmic rays. This is one of the few comics during this era that can be read as a one-shot. Fantastic Four number 52 is the first appearance of Black Panther, so enough said. Fantastic Four number 67, the first appearance of him, the early version of Adam Warlock. This story is just so weird, and it bleeds into Thor as well. Fantastic Four Annual number 6, the first appearance of Annihilus and Franklin Richards. Annihilus, Cosmic Control Rod, Negative Zone, all of these phrases that somehow made their way into our vernacular. They were all created at some dude's raggedy drawing table, which is amazing. Fantastic Four number 94 is the first appearance of Agatha Harkness, and Franklin finally gets a name. I'm throwing this one in here because Kirby would sneak in sorcery and Satanism into some of his comics, even until the end of his career. Fantastic Four is so rooted in sci-fi, so when he throws in magic, it's fun to see how the FF deal with it. Also, the scene where Franklin finally gets his name is one of the best scenes in the series. Thor number 169. I'm going to cheat with this. Kirby tells the origin of Galactus in Thor and not in Fantastic Four. A lot of people will recommend the Galactus trilogy, and while I love that story, it's kind of overrated, and I've said a lot, it's more like an issue and a half of Galactus than an entire trilogy. Fantastic Four number 74 through 77, When Calls Galactus, is a beefier Galactus and Silver Surfer arc, and it's kind of a remake of the original story. So my recommendation is Thor number 169 to get the origin of Galactus straight from the King himself. I'm going to cheat again and mention Fantastic Four Full Circle by Alex Ross from 2022 because it ties into the original run pretty heavily. It reminded me why I love the FF and would say, at least for me, it's the best newer FF comic to come out. It feels like a better bookend to the Kirby and Lee era than the actual last issue they worked on together. There was one inker I neglected to cover and only realized after I edited the whole thing, so I want to cover this inker at the end here. Chic Stone inks a good bit of Kirby's Marvel work in 1964. I've written and talked about how 1964 is the year of Stone. Usually when people talk about him, his 60s pop art inking style comes up. People either like him or really hate him, so the order would be Bell, Stone, Colletta, and Sinnott. There are some parts that I skipped over for brevity or because I've talked about them in depth before. I talked about Kirby leaving Marvel in this essay but didn't dive into it too much. There are 2 previous essays I made that cover his departure more in depth. I also have older write-ups on the 60s Fantastic Four stories on my website for perusal. Those are linked in the description. Mostly, I made this out of my love of the FF, but I also made it for people who are wondering, hey, where do you even start with the Fantastic Four? As someone who loves Silver Age comics, I understand that they're a little hard for new readers to get into, and can be considered dated. These stories are still worth a look, and are a good time, but also add a lot of value to the stories that other writers and artists would create, building from the original material. As always, the transcript for this essay and all of my other videos are available on my website, witsandpod.com. If it's not on there, it's not me. Share these essays around. Thanks for watching. Chaos Ensues. Up next, the 70s.